I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I have been looking forward to this conversation. Everyone knows I like talking to writers, but also, honestly, debut writers are really fun to hang out with and find out where they're coming from and where they're going. And Alejandro Heredia has a new novel out called Loca. It is his debut, and it is sublime and pretty spectacular. And wait until you meet these characters. Alejandro, it's so good to see you. Thank you for making the time.
I'm excited to be here.
I am in love with these characters, and I am in love with the story. And you take us back to 1999 in the Bronx.
Yes.
And we jump back and forth sort of in time, and we go back to the Dominican Republic a little bit. But you and I are going to focus on Sal and Charo, who are the main characters of this book.
Yeah.
We're going to stay away from spoilers. But also, I want you to please introduce Sal and Charo, because they are really terrific characters, and they feel very, very close to you as a reader.
Yeah, no, for sure. So Sal and Charo, they're best friends. They're both Dominican immigrants living in the Bronx in 1999, and they are trying, and I think really failing at building a new life for themselves. The sort of life that they each envisioned that they would live when they left their homes behind to go to a new country. When we meet Sal at the beginning of the novel, he's really excited about going to a job interview at a museum. He's about to go outdoor to go to the interview, and he freezes. And the novel sort of follows Sal's story, trying to understand what is it about his past life that is making him freeze and stopping him from building his new life in New York. And on the other side, Charo, at the beginning of the novel, she's 25, she's a young mom, and she has a partner, and she sort of finds herself very restrained by the domestic expectations of her life. She thought that she would be living her own version of freedom, and this is certainly not it. So she's finding herself sort of at odds with her domestic life and her relationship to motherhood.
And you take us out of the present day.
Yes.
And you drop us into 1999.
Yeah.
And I think for listeners who may not have been roaming around like you and I were, cell phones were not the thing they are now. The internet was not the thing it is now. Like, people did, maybe some folks had email, because that was the time of AOL mailing out discs to people. And like, everyone would use AOL for like 5, and it's kind of entertaining to me to see like who in my life still has an AOL account. But it was information flowed in really different ways, and community was built in really different ways.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's too much to say. It kind of hurts when I think of 1999 as historical fiction.
Yeah.
I mean, technically we're not at the 30-year mark, but if you think about the shifting culture,
right,
and information and community, it feels like it might as well have been 50 or 60 years ago.
Yeah.
And I'd really love to know why you picked, also the whole, Y2K is kind of looming in the background, but you, of course, you never talk about it because you don't need to, but.
Yeah. But we know as readers.
Absolutely. As readers, we do. And that was kind of a wild moment with everyone going, oh no, the computer systems, none of the computer systems can handle it, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But 1999, what does it mean for you? Why do this to your people?
Well, I think primarily the desire to set the novel in the 90s comes from just my curiosity about my parents' generation of immigrants. My parents immigrated to the Bronx in the mid 90s. And I just grew up hearing so many stories about the Bronx in the 1990s, about what it was like to. My mother, for example, lived on Grand Concourse, which is one of the biggest streets in the Bronx.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever we drive down that street, she tells me that she lived in this apartment building and in that apartment building and in that apartment building. She sort of runs as we move through the block. She sort of tells me all the stories of her life on those streets. And so I really wanted to capture that particular moment for what I call the Dominican village in the Bronx, and all of the struggles that people like my mother and my parents and their friends went through, but also some of the triumphs and some of the beautiful things that came out of living in that community. And I also, these are characters that are somehow both trying to not look back, but also incredibly anxious about the future. And so it just made sense for to place them in 1999 when there is so much conspiracy, so much energy about what the future will look like. Not only in regards to Y2K and are our computers going to explode, but also are we going to have flying cars? What does a new millennium even mean? All this anxiety about the future I wanted to sort of set as the backdrop for the novel.
I also love the idea that we can look at the American dream and immigrant stories in a way that challenge kind of a dominant narrative, right? Like here is a community and I really do. I love Sal and Charles' friendship. It ebbs and it flows, and sometimes they're mad at each other and they don't really
Yeah.
talk to each other, or they agree and they anchor each other in a way that we don't always get in novels about friendship.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, I mean, at least for me as a reader, one of the things I love about a novel too is we can be we can get in someone's head, right? The interiority of the characters, and we can watch how they evolve and how they change and how their relationships change. I mean, we don't necessarily experience that the same way on film
Yeah.
or in music or whatnot. So the idea that we have time with everyone, because we do, we bounce back to both of them in high school and when they meet and whatnot. And obviously, I'm not going to give anything away, but the evolution, right? Like part of Charo's story really does break my heart, but she does some cool stuff. I'm just going to say she does some cool stuff, and
She does.
You know the thing I'm talking about, where I'm like, yeah, this is good. This makes me happy. I didn't. Her partner frustrated me, and I understand that he has made a life and has been able to overcome some stuff.
Yeah.
But he made me itch a little bit.
Yeah, and I wanted that energy of
Oh, I know you did.
for
I
all
know
the
what you were doing.
characters, Yeah, I mean, these characters are they're all incredibly flawed, and they all make even the ones that we're rooting for, make some questionable choices, throughout the novel. Sal does, Chado does, Vance, all of them, they all do. But that to me felt like the most honest way of depicting these characters individually and then depicting them collectively too. I love writing about friendship and writing about friendship not in the sort of the kumbaya sort of stereotypical way that we're used to thinking about friendship, but friendship as I've seen it in my life, which is that it can be both. Friendship can be a home, it can be a bond, and it can also be very challenging. We have all had beef with even our closest friends, and I wanted to show that in the novel that that's life, you know?
Well, also too, I mean, I feel like we're in a moment in our culture and our society where the gray area is a very uncomfortable place for a lot of people to sit. And it's either we're on or we're off.
Yes.
And that we're on or we're off is not the same as removing yourself from a situation that is, physically not good for you. Okay. I just want to be clear that we're talking about, obviously don't stay in a situation that's bad. But, I have people that I picked up with and put down. And, life ebbs and flows, right? Like life is messy. No one is perfect when they approach stuff. And that's part of how I could latch on to Sal and Charo the way I did, because I really wanted to know where we were going to go. And they surprised me more than once.
Yeah.
You and I were talking about before we started taping. I was like, oh, and that thing, that other thing. But I want to talk about the creation of this book because you have been working on it for a bit. And the cast is remarkably tight for the ground that you're covering and the amount of time that you cover. I mean, yes, we're 99 essentially, but you are bouncing around in the past as well. So I want to talk about the evolution of the book for you as the writer and where it started and how you found these voices and how we get to where we get. Obviously, we're not telling people exactly where you go.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this novel is so challenging to talk about because we don't want to spoil things, or we want people to know that things happen. I am. The novel first came to me via just hearing Sal and Chado speaking to each other, hearing their dialogue, hearing the things that they say, and also the things that they don't say to each other, what they withhold, was a really, I think that was the entry point for me, and it pushed me to think about, yes, the way that they talk to each other, how they relate to each other, but also the things that are their past the things that they find challenging to talk about, why they find it challenging to talk about, even with each other. I mean, Sal and Shadow have been through so much together.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
best friends, and still there's so much that they can't touch, so much that is sort of left unsaid. And so that was sort of the entryway for the novel. I always knew that I wanted to write a novel about friendship
Mhm.
that focused on these two characters equally. I didn't always know, especially with Chado, I didn't always know what her backstory was and what
Mhm.
her upbringing was. Chado makes 2/3 of the way through the novel, she makes a very, very difficult choice,
Mhm.
and to make that choice make sense during the revision process, I had to sort of work backwards and
Yeah, yeah.
try to ask myself, "Oh, why does she make that choice? What about her upbringing has pushed her to have this particular relationship to family and to her work life and to herself?" I certainly had ideas about what the novel would be from the beginning, that it would be about friendship. I knew a lot of what would happen,
Mhm.
but throughout the revision process, I had to sort of fill in the gaps.
Time, though, the way you handle time,
Yes.
there are some jumps,
Yes.
and you handle them really well, but you do have to make some deliberate structural choices.
Yes.
And when you're mapping out where the story goes, are you following what's sort of in front of you, or are you thinking about, I mean, do you outline? This is really a
I
sideways
do
way
not.
of,
Yeah, I do not outline.
okay.
Maybe I should, but I kind of just follow the novel as it comes
Mm-hmm.
naturally to me. I will say that some of the scenes that sort of happened in the past in the Dominican Republic,
Mm-hmm.
specifically from Sal's point of view or following Sal, that stuff was later in the novel and the
Okay.
very first draft. And throughout the revision process,
Mm-hmm.
working with my editor, Yadon,
Mm-hmm.
we sort of thought, well, some of that stuff needs to come earlier,
Yeah.
but we don't want to sort of give it to the reader all at
Mm-hmm.
once. So how do we make it interweave it so that it makes sense with the narrative as it's being told?
The other thing I really appreciate too is the fact that none of the Spanish is in italics.
Yes, yes,
Thank you so much for that, because I mean
yeah,
it makes me itch. It just makes
yeah,
me itch when I see, because honestly, context clues, I don't speak Spanish,
yeah,
but I live in New York. So I
sure,
have a working understanding of some stuff.
yeah,
Right? And but also context clues and the characters and everything else. And I find it very distracting if a language that is not English appears in italics. I'm like, oh, here we go again. Oh, great.
yeah, yeah. No, that was really important for me, and in so many ways, this novel is about vernacular. I am bringing in all of these different vernaculars, Black American vernacular, Dominican American vernacular, queer Dominican vernacular, and I'm sort of putting them all into the novel, primarily because that was just my reality. People were coming in and out of different vernaculars all the time, just in one conversation. And so I wanted to represent that as truly and honestly as possible in the novel, and that's why it's called Loca, right? Like even that title gestures toward the ways in which queer Dominican folks take words that are meant to harm them and reuse them or reinvent them for self-preservation or to see each other better.
I don't necessarily have the same experience, obviously, of a queer Dominican community that you
Mm,
do, but I was so in the world of Loca.
yeah,
And yeah, I've said it before on the show, but I don't think world building is a phrase that should be limited to sci-fi and fantasy. And
yeah,
we kind of have let it sort of sit there. And I'm like, but we're in parties and we're in small town America, and we
yeah,
cover so much ground in Loca, right?
yeah,
And you're in
yeah,
apartment buildings, and sometimes you're not in an apartment building. There's
yeah,
so much, and yet I felt like I could smell things and I could taste things and I could hear everything going on. But it's that, if you've been out in the world, there's a physicality to this book and the prose in
mm,
this book
mhm,
that I think partially it makes me think you read aloud sometimes when you're crafting your drafts, because the way the sentences flow. And I was having this conversation about cadence at dinner last night, actually, with an editor who's not yours. And her sort of thought about cadence was it's much more sort of formal and I tend to use cadence more like a swing, right? There's a musicality. to your sentences.
Yeah.
And it doesn't come just from the mixing of English and Spanish, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we need to talk about your literary influences, because clearly you are pulling from a lot of different places, and clearly you are a sentence guy, and clearly you are a voice-driven writer, which makes me think you're a voice-driven reader. So how did we get here? How did we get the Alejandro that I'm chatting with over your debut novel?
Yeah, I mean, so many different places. I tend to think about literary influences. When I think about what my literary influences do for me, I think about not what I can sort of replicate or copy from them, but I think about what they give me permission to do.
Oh, that's very cool. I like that.
How does a writer or an author or a novel that I really look up to give me permission and freedom on the page? So much of this novel would not have been possible had I not read Zadie Smith's White Teeth.
Okay.
And NW, right?
I love NW. That is my favorite of her books.
Yes, NW is
absolutely my favorite of her books.
Yes, yeah. But really, I read those books way before starting to draft Loca. But those books gave me permission to write about a portion of the city that people think that they know, and to write about it with rigor and intelligence and curiosity. She's also a writer who sort of brings this sort of chorus of characters into the fold, but you sort of feel connected to each one of them as they move in and out of the page. And I really wanted to replicate some of that in the novel. So there's Zadie Smith. There's this novel called A Visitation of Spirits by Randall Kenan, a novel that I feel like people do not talk enough about. It is a weird, grotesque, beautiful, challenging book. But what I took from that book was the genius way in which Kenan shows how a community that in so many ways loves a queer Black boy also are the source of his self-destruction, or sort of push him towards self-destruction. I'm really interested in the ways in which community, again, is both a balm and a source of alienation of the self, right?
Did you read Ours, the Philip B. Williams novel?
I have not, no.
Okay, if you have just when you have time.
Okay.
You teach and you do 8 million other things, but there's a thread there about the push and pull of community and what it means, and it's very character driven. It is also not short, but it is worth every page. It's meant to be, these novels by poets, which are such a treat.
Yeah.
I think you would really like it though, and just the way you're talking about the Kenan makes me think of Williams, who is also just a really decent dude.
Yeah.
He's just a really great guy. But I want to go back to something you just said a second ago about writing about community with rigor. And I think that's a really interesting turn of phrase. It's not a word I've heard writers use recently to talk about how they choose to work. So what do you mean when you say writing with vigor? Or rigor, excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, what I mean by that is that I think in our contemporary moment, we have very, to me, facile and sometimes reductive ways of thinking about community. We think about community as people who either, one, share in our identities all the time. We are only hang out with people that share our identities. Or two, that we are only ever in community with people that agree with us every single second of the day. But the reality is that, at least my reality and the reality that I come from, is that even in what I call the Dominican village in the Bronx, there is so much disagreement, there is so much beef, there is so much sort of talking or not talking across difference. Um, and I think it would behoove us to think about community as a place or as a space that is dynamic. And it's filled with contradiction and paradox and complexity, rather than a place where, yes, we all want to feel safe and heard and understood. But the reality is that I don't think community is always a place where you always feel heard or understood or seen entirely. But we belong to these communities for better or worse, and we have to contend with that.
And I think, too, it's kind of interesting to think of community as a place where you form yourself in opposition to what's around you.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. It's like sometimes you find a way to model behavior that you like, and sometimes you find a way to go, oh, no, that is not going to be me. not going to be me. And I do think we need more space for those narratives where you choose actively to not continue what came before.
Exactly. I mean, just in a very, foundational way, Chado is coming in, and Loca Chado is coming in to this Dominican village in the Bronx. And in so many ways, it is a life saving space because she's surrounded by people who look like her and speak like her. And so there's a sense of comfort in that. And at the same time, all of the expectations and molding
Mm-hmm.
that she experienced back home is sort of brought across the diaspora into this new space. And she's walking around having to, you know, avoid her parents' friends in the neighborhood on the block, for example, because they're constantly asking her questions about responsibilities that she doesn't know that she wants. And so I wanted to sort of show both. I didn't want
Mm-hmm.
to show that it's just that these characters are just at odds with their community.
Right.
I wanted to show that there are times where it's comforting and that there are times where community makes one can make one feel really alienated from oneself.
The claustrophobia, right? The
Yeah.
claustrophobia of
Yeah.
other people's expectations.
Yes.
And you're
Yeah.
just like, "Wah! Wait, I'm sorry, that was not my plan. Excuse me, why would you make that decision for me?"
Yes. Yes.
That was not no. And
Yeah, yeah, and of course, I just want to add that part of what the novel is doing in the tradition of queer storytelling is that it's showing that the community that we receive is not always the community that we choose, and that sometimes there is quite a lot of power in choosing the kind of folks that we want to be surrounded by and in community with. So,
it was really interesting for me watching Sal and Vance's relationship sort of roll out because they're both so young. And I'm like, well, you're babies. You haven't figured it out yet. And listen, that's not to say that you can't sort of figure things out early. That is not what I'm saying. But at the same time, watching the evolution of these two young men figure out like where they stand in regards to each other and where they stand in regards to the world. And Vance's career is like really, there is a very clear trajectory and there's a lot of opportunity. And as you said, the novel opens with Sal freezing and he's meant to go to this interview for a job he really, really wants. And
yeah.
he just freezes. And I will say it is a great way to open a story because you had my attention immediately.
Okay, good.
You
Good,
had
good,
my
good.
attention immediately because I was like, what is going on with this kid? Is
Yeah,
he okay? And
yeah,
where are we going to go from here?
yeah.
And I'm wondering though if that was the original opening for the manuscript or if you had to sort of come back and noodle it a little bit.
It's funny. It was always the opening, but
Okay.
I did workshop sort of get so much feedback about
Mhm.
that opening, and I remember during the MFA when I brought a particular portion, the opening of the novel, people really thought that the party scene later on in chapter one should
Oh,
be the opening. It's 1999. Everyone is existential. Sal is not the only one. That sort of screams opening of a novel, right?
it does, but I'm glad you didn't open with. I mean, and
Yeah,
I like that whole
yeah,
set. It really is a terrific set of pages. But I needed the intimacy of this kid.
yes, yes.
I sort of needed, and I think too, if you look at some of the literature of immigrant communities,
Mhm.
it gets sort of set up in a way where you're like, I don't want to say you're feeding into stereotypes, but again, this goes back to the expectations, right? What are the
Yeah.
expectations of, say, an outside reader versus someone who's a member of the community? Sal is the beating heart, Charo
Mhm.
too, but like Sal and Charo are the beating heart of
Mhm.
this novel, and a party scene maybe wasn't. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
glad you opened the way you did.
Yeah, and it was also intentional because one of my mentors, Adam Hazley, talks a lot about how the opening of a novel teaches you how to read the rest of the novel.
Yeah.
And I am a writer of images.
Mm-hmm.
I spend a lot of time constructing images and trying to create a language around images so that the reader is able to understand, even if they don't know what's going on in Sal's mind through an image, they might be able to guess some kind of entryway into his interiority. And so opening up with that image of this young man
Mm-hmm.
by the window, bathed in sunlight, washing dishes, very sort of mundane action, that to me felt really important just to set up the kinds of linguistic investments of the novel.
The linguistic investments, but also masculinity, right? The way we talk about masculinity. And my experience of sort of masculinity, the way masculinity is presented is sort of in the Dominican community, facing outwards, right? Because obviously not a member of the community, but that there is so much value placed in a certain kind of performance of masculinity. And that can be dangerous for some people. I don't think Charo's partner is the worst dude ever, but like he carries around some stuff that he learned.
Yeah.
Right? Like I don't believe that you show up in the world thinking, oh, well, I'm going to run the world this way because I have, this set of chromosomes versus another set of chromosomes. And I love the idea that Sal it's not code switching. It's not. He just moves in the world and sort of understands certain pieces of it better than other pieces.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's true. And the novel does pose a lot of questions around expectations of gender for all of these characters, right? For Charo as a young woman, as a young mother.
She caught some stuff from the community. I was mad.
Oh yeah.
I was mad at some people's response to her. I was mad. I was just like, who are you to judge? Excuse me.
No, it's true. It's true. Yeah, and even around the question of queerness, right? That there's that scene toward the beginning of the novel of sort of Sal's coming to queerness with his childhood best friend Yadiel, and that entire scene, that entire exploration of their childhood in that way, to me was about not necessarily exploring their sexuality, which is what we think about when we think about queerness, but actually their gender and how they're coming to their relationship to their gender, vis-a-vis what they wear, how they dance, how they move about the world.
You cover so much ground.
Yeah.
You cover so much ground. And I was really invested. I was really invested in the characters. I was really invested in the way you tell the story. I think there's so much, too, about the way you write about class. You cannot write a story about queer communities or immigrant communities or even New York City. Because I'm sorry, when I think of the Bronx, I think of New York City. I'm one of those people where I'm like, it's all New York. Like, New York City is not just this one tiny squib of island, right? But you can't separate class, right? Like, we take a little detour outside of New York for a second, and there's a character who has attempted to change her circumstances. And she's like, well, everyone in my town, everyone was rooting for me until they weren't. Because she was starting to succeed at college and everything else. And people were like, oh, well, look at you, fancy pants. There's always kind of that undercurrent of who do you think you are? So watching these kids figure out who they are in the face of that is pretty terrific. But I would also imagine not the easiest thing for you to experience as you're writing, because you are deep in the emotion of it. You are deep in their discovery.
For sure. And I think that was a reality for their reality, a part of their reality that I really had to contend with. They all of these young people have so many dreams about and desires, and they want so much out of life, and they're held back very practically by economic circumstance, right? There are so many things that they can't do because they don't have the money to do it. They're struggling to pay rent. And so I wanted to show that reality in contrast to all of the sort of philosophical, existential dread that these characters are going through. That one can, you can go through your own spiritual, emotional journey. You could be going through your journey, and then you face the obvious obstacle of, oh wait, I've been doing all this thinking and feeling, but I have to pay my bills at the end of this month. That sort of balance, I think, was really important for me to strike in my novel.
Yeah, you've got this great line. Most of us wanted what we were promised. Possibility, right? Like, some of us wake up in the morning, we don't have to think about it. We do our thing.
Yeah.
Right? It's really expensive to be poor. It's really expensive to be poor. It is really hard to be poor. But possibility is something that, we're all the American dream, right? The mythology of the American dream. You work really hard, you do your thing. Hey, anything is possible. And yet, sometimes no matter how hard you work or where you are,
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't.
And and I think that sometimes, sometimes in literary fictions, we tend to shy away from including
Mm-hmm.
any mentioning of money,
Mm-hmm.
unless somebody's really wealthy in a novel or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. That's one way that money comes up. But for the rest of us, it's a real thing that most Americans have to think about on a day to day. And so I just wanted to ground the novel in that reality for these characters that they do have to think about money and their bills all the time, and it motivates so many of their decisions as they're also having these existential crises.
Yeah, but also I'm tired of the narratives where, characters don't get to be messy and human just because they're in a book,
Yeah, yeah,
right? Like, that's kind of not so interesting when everything works out. I'm not adverse to happy endings, right? Like, and I'm
yeah,
not saying that you don't have a happy ending on Loca. It's just maybe not exactly what I was expecting, but
yeah, yeah,
I was maybe hoping for something. Anyway,
yeah.
but
Me too. I know what you're talking about, and
yes,
me
right?
too. I also wanted that, and
You were surprised too.
I
I'm
was
delighted
surprised.
to
Yes.
know I was not the only person who was surprised. But hey, Sal's got to do what Sal's got to do. But the idea that these kids are really fully fleshed out on the page and they are genuine people, and that clearly you were surprised too as you were writing this book. I mean, that
Yeah.
to me is kind of the joy of reading this. And there is so much love, even when everyone's mad at each other, because, hi, human. Even when they're mad, even when they don't agree with the decisions, the love is always there.
Yeah.
But sometimes maybe you have to not be next door, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's true. And yeah, I guess I was just really and continue to be really invested in showing the ways in which we love each other deeply, but also the ways in which we fail each other deeply.
Mm-hmm.
There's a conversation between Don Julio, who is Sal's very whimsical, interesting, nuanced roommate who's older,
Yeah.
and Sal. And at one point, Don Julio tells Sal, we can always be better to the people that we love, even when we're going through trials and tribulations, even when we are at the margin of XYZ social issue.
Mm-hmm.
We have a responsibility to each other to continue showing up.
We do. And also, alienation can be used to build a new thing, right? If the
Yeah.
old thing isn't working, if the old
Yeah.
community isn't the thing that you need, if even your family of origin is not the thing, like you can, in fact, build a new thing. It might be a little hard at first, but that's part of the joy that I get out of watching these characters sort of, do their thing on the page,
Yeah.
is that they build a new thing.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. That's a really great way of putting it. I had not thought about it that way, but when someone doesn't want you or something doesn't want you,
Mm.
that frees you in some
Mhm.
ways to go elsewhere. So,
And it may not feel like that at first, but
yes,
I
rejection
mean,
feels horrible.
yeah, people are messy and hard, and you give everyone all of the emotion. I mean,
Yeah,
these characters are really alive. There
yeah,
isn't, you and I have both read enough where, occasionally you stumble into a book where you're like,
yeah,
oh, I'm good, thanks. Bye.
yeah, yeah,
Not for me. Not.
yeah,
I'm going to hand this off to someone else. This book is meant for someone else that is not me. But the idea that really everyone gets to have their experience, and it is genuine to each of them, and it isn't just a, hey, I need this character to do this thing so this other character can do this. It's
yeah, yeah. Yeah, sometimes I mean they're not at the service the narrative, they're at the service of themselves. They're
yeah.
invested in themselves first, and I wanted to show that truth on the page.
How does it feel to have this book out in the world?
Oh God. Um it feels like I am giving the world a younger version of myself and saying, here, make up your mind about it. And I've been working on this novel, or I've worked on this novel for 6 years,
Right.
and so much of my tastes and interests have grown and evolved. But even towards the end, when I was revising, I remember saying to myself, wanting to like change certain things. And I thought, actually, I need to honor this, 25, 26-year-old Alejandro who is writing a novel for 25, 26-year-olds who are asking themselves these kinds of questions. And so it really does feel like honoring a younger version of myself and saying, this young person had so many questions about the world, and here's this novel where I get to explore all of that.
You did get an MFA.
I did. Yeah. Hunter College. Yeah, yeah.
You know, everyone has feelings to MFA, to not MFA. Do you need it? Do you not do it? What did you get from pursuing the degree that you might not have gotten otherwise? I mean, also, again, Hunter is a fabulous program.
Yeah, it's an incredible. So I will say that when I got to Hunter, I already had a full draft of Loca, and I had
Oh,
revised it a couple of times.
okay.
Um, and so when I went to Hunter, what I really wanted was, generous, intelligent readers that could tell me what was coming across on the page, what was
Right.
legible, what was not legible, what wasn't working. And that's exactly what I got. I mean, I was able to work with really incredible people like Adam Hazlitt and Sigurd Nunez, who just gave me really honest
Yeah.
feedback about
Hmm.
about the novel. And equally, my classmates also were instrumental in just me getting feelers for out there for what was working, what wasn't
Yeah.
working. That kind of feedback is invaluable. And to have then 2 years to just
Hmm.
work on a novel.
Yeah.
It was great. I understand that so many folks have, especially writers of color, have challenging times in the MFA, but I was very blessed that that was not my experience. I had a really incredible time.
Well, it also sounds like you found community. Like you
Yes.
keep finding layers of community. And I really,
Yes.
I appreciate we all move in the world in different, right? Like there is no one community that claims all of us 100% of the time.
Yeah, and we show different parts of ourselves to different
Yeah, yeah,
different
yeah.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so, watching Sal and Charo move through the world, right? And
Yeah.
and watching how they adjust to community. And so code switching is not a phrase I like. I
Mhm.
understand why it became part of vernacular,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I some of us just we move through the world,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you can evolve or adjust or whatever you want to call it, but code switching just feels like a label that someone went, "Oh, this will work." I'm like,
Yes.
well,
Yes.
actually.
Yeah. And I do think as a novelist, my my investment is in trying to find language that is useful, new language that is useful. And I think sometimes we do ourselves a disservice by just following along with the language of sociology or whatever that are given to us, right? Like we are supposed to believe and not question the language of intersectionality and code switching and all these terms that I understand the sociological and political utility of this language.
Mhm.
And also my job as a novelist is to find new language that feels more capacious.
And we can have both in the world, right? Like everything has its place in the world. I want more of the actual humanity of the thing, right? Like I
Yeah.
think there are some readers who would much rather experience Loca, and you do experience this novel, experience Loca than necessarily pick up maybe a textbook
Yeah.
or a piece of serious, researched whatever kind of thing.
Mhm.
And I love the idea that you're opening the door for folks to have an experience.
Mhm.
And I don't think we often talk about, I think we talk about genre fiction in a way, certainly science fiction and fantasy, where it's, the experience of the thing, you're otherworldly, da 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 da.
Yeah.
But I mean, the Bronx is Bronx, right?
Yes.
And the
Yes.
Dominican village of the Bronx is the Dominican village.
Yeah.
And I love the idea that this place is also very much a character and you've mapped it in a way where I may not know the physical terrain, but I'm pretty sure I understand the emotional terrain
Yeah.
of this place. And I love that.
Yeah.
There are certain places that I have experience of where I'm like, oh yeah, I get that.
It has become, and I think through this publication process, it's become even more clear just how important it is for me to think of myself as a writer from the Bronx. You know, the Bronx is a place that is deep in myth. There is
Mm-hmm.
so much that people think that they know about the Bronx.
Mm-hmm.
So many stereotypes, so many narratives. And part of what I was trying to do with this novel was to show the complexity and the nuance of those streets. To say it can be all these things that you think it is, and it is also all these other things that people have no idea that are happening in the Bronx. Like I remember I wrote this. There's this scene in the novel where Sal's going on a walk at 3 in the morning, and he has his mother's voice in his head, who's telling him, you shouldn't be walking outside in the Bronx so late. And at 3 in the morning, he finds a diner and he comes across this couple who's on a date at 3 in the morning because of their jobs. It just so happens to align only at this time. And that to me was a moment of tenderness and of connection and of love that's happening at a time and in a place where we don't think one might find that tenderness and that love. So for me, it continues to be really important to expand the possibilities of what can exist in the Bronx.
I love that. I love that so much. And I love the riff on tenderness because I do think that there's a place for that
Yeah.
in literary fiction and the kinds of stories that you're telling. Have you started the next thing?
I have, yes. There's a new thing. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to guess that means you're not talking about it until you're ready to. But
Not yet.
I'm always
Not
gonna
yet.
ask.
Not yet.
Okay, that's
but
fair. That's totally fair.
Yeah.
That seems like a perfect place to end because now I think readers have a really good idea of who these characters are, what the Bronx is like. Even though I still think of it as New York, but okay, I understand.
Yeah. It's 100% New York. 100% New York. Yes.
It's both. It's both. That's a lot of what this conversation has been about, Alejandro, is both. We get both.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that. And I love Loca, and I love Sal, and I love Charo, and I'm so happy to see you. So thank you for joining us on Poured Over.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.